It was one of those nights that made you wish you had come home earlier. The rain had started suddenly, hammering against the street like handfuls of pebbles. The sky was dark, no stars, no moon, just thick clouds swallowing all light. He drove slowly through the narrow road leading to his small house at the edge of town. His wipers squeaked with every pass, but they barely cleared the windshield. The storm had come out of nowhere, and every few seconds, lightning cut through the darkness, followed by deep thunder that shook the ground. Inside the car, the heater was weak and his hands trembled slightly as he held the steering wheel. He was tired. The factory shift had been long, and the storm made everything feel heavier. When he finally turned into his street, it was almost empty. Most houses were dark, everyone inside hiding from the rain. He parked under the old tree that leaned toward his front yard. The rain fell harder now, and he waited a few seconds before opening the door, trying to gather the courage to run through it. He took a deep breath, grabbed his small lunchbox, and made a dash for it. The cold water hit him like needles. By the time he reached his porch, he was already soaked. He pushed the key into the lock, but before he could open the door, the power went out. Everything went black. Only the sound of the storm remained. He sighed and muttered under his breath, pulling out his phone to use the flashlight. The weak glow from the screen gave him just enough light to see the hallway. He stepped inside, dripping all over the wooden floor. He set his lunchbox on the small table by the wall and took off his wet jacket. The air felt heavy, the kind that made you feel uneasy for no clear reason. Maybe it was the silence between the thunderclaps, or maybe just the long day catching up with him. He moved to the kitchen, planning to heat up the leftover soup from yesterday once the power returned. But then something made him stop. It was faint at first, a soft sound like footsteps. He turned off his phone light for a second and listened carefully. The rain masked most noises, but there it was again. A dull thump. Then another. It seemed to come from the backyard. His stomach tightened. The sound wasn't from the storm. It was too distinct. He slowly moved toward the window over the sink and peeked through the blinds. The backyard was pitch black. He waited, staring, barely breathing. A flash of lightning lit up the yard for a brief moment, and in that split second he thought he saw movement near the tool shed. He froze. The shed door looked slightly open. He was sure he had locked it in the morning. He turned on his phone light again, pointing it through the window, but the distance was too far to see clearly. His mind started racing. He remembered hearing about a few break-ins around the area last week. Someone had been stealing tools, bikes, anything they could grab quickly before running off into the woods. He told himself maybe it was just the wind, but the sound came again. A scrape, a metallic clink. His pulse began to rise. He quietly stepped away from the window, his heart thumping in his ears. He felt for the umbrella stand near the door and pulled out the old iron rod he kept there. It wasn't much, but it made him feel safer. He stood still for a long moment, just listening. The rain grew louder, slapping against the windows. Then came another sound, footsteps again, this time closer to the house. He swallowed hard. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a thief. Maybe nothing. But fear doesn't wait for logic. It fills the silence and makes every shadow feel alive. He switched off his phone light to keep from being seen and quietly moved toward the back door. His shoes made faint squeaks on the wet floor. His breathing quickened. He could almost feel the air outside pushing against the windows. When he reached the door, he slowly turned the handle. It creaked and he winced at the noise. Cold air rushed in as he stepped out into the rain. The darkness outside felt heavier than it did from inside. Every drop hit his skin like a warning. He crouched slightly and started walking toward the shed. The puddles soaked through his shoes. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Lightning flashed again, and this time he clearly saw it. The shadow of a person moving near the shed. His heart skipped. The figure was holding something in their hand, something small and shiny. He couldn't tell what it was, but in that moment his mind filled in the blanks. Maybe it was a weapon, maybe a knife. His grip tightened on the rod. He called out, his voice breaking the storm. "Who's there?" he shouted. The figure froze for a second but didn't run. Instead, they turned toward him, the flashlight from a phone flickering briefly in their hand. That glow made their face unrecognizable, just a blur of light and rain. He felt his heartbeat slam in his chest. "I said stop!" he shouted again, stepping closer. The figure took a few quick steps forward, trying to say something, but the storm drowned out their voice. The next few seconds felt like a blur. His fear took control, louder than thought, faster than reason. Without even realizing it, he raised the rod. A flash of lightning tore through the sky at that exact moment, and the figure shouted something. A single word he couldn't make out. He swung anyway. The sound that followed wasn't loud. Just a dull, heavy thud that cut through the rain. Then silence. For a few seconds he didn't move. His arm froze in midair, the rod still in his hand. The rain poured down harder, mixing with the mud beneath his shoes. His breathing grew fast and uneven. Slowly he looked down. The person was lying still on the wet ground. The small flashlight had fallen beside them, its beam flickering across the grass. His stomach turned cold. He dropped the rod and fell to his knees. "Hey, hey!" he said, shaking the person's shoulder. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" There was no response. He turned the flashlight toward their face, and the light trembled in his shaking hand. The sight made his chest collapse inward. He couldn't speak. He just stared. The world around him disappeared. No rain, no thunder, nothing. Just the sound of his own breathing. The face before him was familiar. Too familiar. He staggered backward, almost slipping on the wet ground. His throat went dry, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. The person lying there wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some thief. It was someone he knew. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. His hands shook as he reached down again. "No, no, no," he whispered. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The figure's hand twitched slightly, and that gave him a spark of hope. "Hold on," he said, fumbling for his phone. His wet fingers could barely unlock the screen. He called for help, shouting into the storm for someone, anyone, to come. The minutes that followed felt endless. He kept talking, trying to keep the person awake, his voice breaking between words. The rain washed over both of them, cold and relentless. When he finally saw the distant red and blue lights through the curtain of rain, he almost cried with relief. The paramedics rushed in, asking quick questions, their voices firm and calm. He stepped back, shaking all over, unable to explain anything clearly. His words came out broken and messy. They lifted the person carefully, checking their pulse, their breathing. Someone told him to stay back. One of the officers asked what happened, but he couldn't form a full sentence. I thought someone was breaking in," he stammered. "I didn't know. There was no light. I didn't know." The officer nodded slowly but said nothing. They led him toward the porch while the medics worked. He stood there soaked, staring at the ground. The rain finally began to ease, turning into a slow drizzle. The quiet made everything worse. He looked up at the shed again, its door still open, swinging gently in the wind. As they carried the stretcher past him, his eyes met the face again. He felt the world tilt as if everything around him blurred away. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but nothing came out. He just stood there, speechless, watching as the ambulance doors closed. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving him standing in the rain with the cold rod still lying near his feet. He didn't know how long he stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The storm finally ended, but inside him it had just begun. He walked back into his house, dripping water across the floor. The lights flickered once and came back on. The house looked the same as before, but it didn't feel like home anymore. He sank into the chair near the door, staring at his trembling hands. He thought about the footsteps, the shadow, the sound of rain, and how easily fear had taken control. He had acted without thinking. Now he couldn't take it back. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew. The truth would hurt more than anything the storm could ever bring. The night passed in pieces. Every hour felt like a blur, a mix of flashing lights, sirens, and voices asking questions he couldn't answer. When the ambulance disappeared down the road, he stood there, staring after it until the sound faded completely. The rain had stopped, but everything around him was soaked. The grass, the porch, his clothes, even the air. It was cold and heavy, as if the world itself didn't want to move. He sat inside for a long time, not speaking, not thinking. The clock on the wall ticked, each sound echoing in his head. His phone lay beside him, screen cracked from when he dropped it earlier. The police had told him to wait for a call. They said someone would update him once they reached the hospital. But the minutes turned to hours and no one called. He just sat there, listening to the sound of dripping water from his shoes onto the floor. When the phone finally buzzed, he jumped. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it again. He pressed it to his ear. A calm voice told him that his brother was in surgery. The words felt unreal, like something from far away. He thanked them softly, though his voice barely made a sound. After the call ended, he just sat still, staring at nothing. He tried to remember every detail of what had happened. The footsteps, the light, the shout. It all came back in flashes, broken pieces that didn't fit together. The more he tried to think, the more his chest tightened. He wished he could go back just 5 minutes before he stepped outside. If he had waited, if he had called out again, if he had just looked closer, so many ifs, none of them helping now. By morning, the rain had stopped completely. The sun peeked through the clouds, but it didn't bring warmth. The ground outside was muddy, and the yard still looked like a scene from a bad dream. The shed door hung open, swaying gently in the morning wind. The rod he'd used still lay near the path, half buried in wet dirt. He couldn't look at it for more than a second. He turned away and went back inside. He changed into dry clothes, made coffee, but didn't drink it. His hands were too unsteady. After pacing around for almost an hour, he finally grabbed his jacket and left for the hospital. The walk from the parking lot felt longer than it should have. His shoes squeaked on the polished floor. The smell of disinfectant and the quiet hum of machines filled the air. At the reception, he gave his brother's name. The nurse looked at him kindly, but with that practiced calm hospital staff have. She asked him to wait. The word wait hit him again like a weight. He sat down on one of the blue plastic chairs, tapping his fingers on his knees, staring at the floor. Every minute felt stretched. When the doctor finally came out, his heart raced. The man looked tired, his eyes serious but gentle. "He's stable for now," he said quietly. "It was a head injury. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but we'll need to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. He nodded slowly, trying to take it all in, though the words swam around him like fog. The doctor added, "You can see him soon, but he needs rest." He whispered a thank you and sat back down. His shoulders dropped with relief, but it didn't erase the ache in his chest. Stable for now. That was good, he told himself. That was something. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. The waiting room was quiet except for the sound of the television playing softly in the corner. After some time, the nurse led him to the room. The smell of medicine grew stronger. Machines beeped softly beside the bed. His brother lay still, pale, with a bandage across his forehead. The sight made him stop in the doorway. He wanted to move closer, but his feet felt heavy. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. For a while, he said nothing. He just watched the slow rise and fall of his brother's chest. "I didn't know," he whispered finally. "I swear I didn't know." His voice broke halfway through. He covered his face with his hands. The guilt pressed down harder than ever. Every time he blinked, he saw that moment again. The swing, the flash of light, the sound that followed. He wished he could erase it, but it replayed over and over. A nurse entered to check the monitors, and he quickly wiped his eyes. She smiled softly at him, the kind of smile that tried to offer comfort without words. When she left, he stood up and looked at the window. Outside, the city was quiet after the storm. Everything looked washed clean, but inside him, nothing felt that way. Hours passed. He stayed there until the nurse gently told him to go home and rest. He didn't argue. On the way back, the streets looked different. The same houses, the same signs, but they all felt distant. When he reached his house, the yard still held the signs of the night before. The muddy footprints, the open shed, the wet grass. He forced himself to walk to the shed, closing the door carefully this time. Inside, he saw what his brother had come for. The old wrench sat lying on the floor, its lid half open. A part of him broke quietly at the sight. He picked it up and carried it inside, placing it on the table. He sat staring at it, remembering how often his brother had borrowed tools from him, sometimes without even asking. They had laughed about it so many times. "You're the one who forgets you have them," his brother would always tease. The memory made his throat tighten. The phone rang again later that evening. It was his mother. Her voice trembled as she asked what had happened. He told her everything, as much as he could, though it felt like he was confessing to something unforgivable. She didn't yell. She didn't say much. She just listened. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then she said softly, "You need to be there when he wakes up." And she hung up. The next few days moved slowly. He went to the hospital every morning and stayed until night. Sometimes his brother seemed to stir, but then he'd fall back into sleep. The doctor said it would take time. Every day he sat by the bed, holding his hand, whispering small things about home, about their old dog, about anything that might help. He didn't know if his brother could hear him, but he spoke anyway. Each night when he came home, the guilt followed him like a shadow. He stopped turning on the lights. He couldn't look at the backyard anymore. The rod was still outside where the police had left it after the investigation. They told him it was clearly self-defense, that no charges would be filed. But that didn't comfort him. In his heart, there was no defense. There was only regret. One night, as he sat alone at the kitchen table, his eyes fell on his brother's phone lying beside the wrench set. The police had returned it that morning. He hadn't touched it yet. Slowly, he picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen lit up, showing a few missed messages and one unsent text. He opened it. It was written to him. The words were short and simple. "Hey, I'm outside. Borrowing the wrench set. Don't get scared, okay?" His breath caught. The message had never reached him. He checked the time. It was sent exactly 2 minutes before the power went out that night. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding again, but this time from pain, not fear. He placed the phone on the table and covered his face. A long, quiet cry escaped him, the kind that came from somewhere deep where words couldn't reach. He stayed like that for a while, not moving, not thinking. The clock ticked softly in the background. When he finally lifted his head, the coffee on the stove had gone cold again. He walked to the sink, poured it out, and just stood there looking out the window. The moon had come out now, soft and clear, shining over the backyard. It was calm, peaceful, the opposite of that night. He whispered to himself, "If I had just waited." The words floated into the quiet air and disappeared. Days turned into weeks. His brother slowly began to recover, though the memory of that night stayed like a scar between them. When he finally opened his eyes, there were no angry words, just a look, one filled with confusion and sadness. He apologized again and again, though he knew it could never undo what had happened. Even after his brother left the hospital, the guilt stayed with him. It changed how he saw things. Every noise at night, every unexpected sound reminded him of how fear had made him act before he thought. He realized that sometimes the danger isn't outside the door. It's the panic that grows inside your own mind. That understanding didn't come all at once. It came slowly in quiet moments, like when he sat beside his brother during recovery, or when he walked past the shed and noticed how still everything was. The world had gone back to normal, but inside him something had shifted forever. He couldn't look at fear the same way again. He had lived his whole life believing that fear keeps you safe, but now he knew that sometimes fear blinds you before it protects you. And when that happens, the cost can be more than you ever imagined. The days after his brother returned home were quieter than ever. The laughter that once filled their small house had turned into long stretches of silence. They spoke only when necessary, and even then their voices were soft, careful, as if one wrong word could reopen the wound that had barely begun to heal. He tried to act normal. He cooked, cleaned, and helped his brother move around, but the guilt followed him like a shadow that refused to fade. Every time he saw the small scar near his brother's hairline, his chest tightened. He would quickly look away, pretending to be busy with something else. His brother didn't blame him, at least he never said so. But the silence between them said everything words couldn't. One evening, while helping him walk to the porch, his brother stopped halfway and looked toward the backyard. The tool shed stood quietly in the fading light. The door had been fixed, the mud had dried, and the grass was growing again. "You should throw that old rod away," his brother said suddenly. His voice was calm, but there was a sadness beneath it. He didn't answer at first. He just nodded slowly. "Yeah," he whispered. They sat on the porch for a while, neither speaking. The sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. It should have been a peaceful evening, but peace wasn't something that came easily anymore. Later that night, as his brother slept, he found himself standing by the window again, staring out at the yard. The same place where everything had gone wrong. He thought about how fear had taken over that night, how it had silenced every bit of reason in him. He had always believed that fear was what kept people safe, but now he knew it could also destroy what mattered most. He remembered something his father used to say: "Fear is like fire. It can warm your hands or burn your home down." Back then, he never paid attention. Now those words haunted him. The next morning he decided to do something, anything, to quiet the noise in his head. He went back to work. The factory smelled the same, loud and oily, filled with the steady rhythm of machines. His co-workers welcomed him back with brief smiles and light pats on the shoulder. They had heard what happened, but no one mentioned it. Maybe they thought silence was kinder. He worked through the day, forcing his thoughts to stay on the tasks in front of him. For a few hours it worked. He almost felt normal. But then, during lunch break, someone brought up the string of break-ins that had been happening around town again. "They caught the guy last week," one man said between bites. "Turns out it was just some kid stealing scrap metal." "Can you believe that?" His hand froze halfway to his mouth. The words hit him like a wave. The night of the storm, the shadow he saw. He had assumed it was the thief everyone was talking about. The same fear that made him act before thinking. But the thief hadn't even been near his neighborhood that night. He couldn't finish his lunch. He went outside and stood by the fence, staring at the cloudy sky. His stomach felt hollow. Every time he thought the guilt couldn't get heavier, something made it worse. When he got home that evening, his brother was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "You okay?" his brother asked, noticing the blank look on his face. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just tired." But later that night he told him the truth, that the thief had been caught days before, that there hadn't been any danger that night at all. His brother listened quietly, then leaned back in his chair. There was a long pause before he said, "You were scared. That's what fear does, it lies to you." He looked down ashamed. "I keep wishing I could take it back," he said softly. His brother gave a small, tired smile. "You can't, but maybe you can make it mean something." Those words stayed with him. The next morning he woke up with a new thought in his mind. He couldn't undo what happened, but maybe he could do something with it, something good. He started volunteering at a local community safety group that met every weekend. They held meetings where people talked about emergency responses, home safety, and how to stay calm under pressure. At first, he just sat in the back listening quietly. But one day, one of the organizers asked if anyone wanted to share a personal experience about acting on fear. He hesitated, but then he raised his hand. His voice trembled as he spoke. He told them about the night of the storm, about the footsteps, the shadow, and the split-second decision that changed everything. He didn't go into details that would make it too heavy, but he spoke honestly about how fear had clouded his mind and how regret had followed him since. The room was silent when he finished. No one judged him. Instead, a few people nodded slowly, understanding. After the meeting, several strangers came up to him, thanking him for sharing. One older man said, "You probably saved someone's life tonight by reminding us to think before we act." For the first time in a long while, he felt a small bit of peace. Maybe his story could help someone else avoid the same mistake. He started attending every week after that. Sometimes he helped set up chairs or handed out flyers. Other times he just listened. Each session felt like a small step toward forgiveness, not from others, but from himself. Back home, things slowly began to feel lighter, too. His brother's health improved, and though there was still distance between them, they were talking again. They even fixed the motorcycle together one weekend, laughing awkwardly when they dropped a wrench. It wasn't like before, but it was something. One evening, as they sat outside, his brother said, "You know, I used to think fear was weakness. But it's not. It's what you do with it that matters." He nodded, watching the sun sink below the trees. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but I wish I had learned that another way." His brother gave him a small smile. "Maybe you had to learn it this way so others don't have to." That night, he wrote in his journal for the first time since the accident. He wrote about how fear feels when it takes over, how fast it moves, how it blinds reason. He also wrote about forgiveness, how it doesn't come all at once, but piece by piece like sunlight breaking through clouds. Over the next few months, he began visiting schools with the safety group, talking to students about fear, decisions, and the importance of staying calm. He never used his full story, only the lessons. He didn't want pity. He wanted people to understand that fear is a feeling, not a command. One day, after a talk, a young woman approached him. She said she had nearly hurt someone once because she panicked in the dark, mistaking a friend for an intruder. "Your story reminded me to slow down next time," she said softly. It might have saved us both. Her words brought tears to his eyes. That night when he got home, he stood in the backyard again. The moonlight spilled across the grass, calm and gentle. He realized that for the first time, he didn't feel afraid of that space anymore. He knelt down dug a small hole near the shed, and buried the old rod there. "You caused pain," he whispered, "but maybe now you can rest." The wind moved through the trees, soft and slow. He stayed there for a moment, feeling the cool air on his skin. Then he stood up and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. The house was quiet, but not empty. His brother was asleep on the couch, a blanket over him. The television glowed faintly in the background, showing some late-night show neither of them really watched. He sat down nearby, letting the sound fill the silence. He realized something then. Fear had once controlled him, but now he was learning to understand it. He couldn't erase the past, but he could shape what came after. Every talk he gave, every person he spoke to was a way of saying sorry. Not just to his brother, but to himself. When he finally went to bed, he slept without waking from nightmares for the first time in months. The storm outside was gone. In its place was calm. Real, steady calm that comes only after facing what once terrified you. And as he drifted into sleep, he thought about the lesson he had learned the hardest way possible. Fear can protect, but when it rules your heart, it can also take everything you love. The difference is whether you act from courage or from panic. He had learned that truth too late, but not so late that it couldn't change the rest of his life. The days after that night felt like a fog that never lifted. Daniel woke up every morning hoping it had all been a bad dream. But reality met him in the same way each day, heavy, quiet, and cold. The house didn't sound the same anymore. There was no laughter from the other room, no sound of two brothers arguing about something small and silly, just the hum of the ceiling fan and the sound of his own thoughts. He barely ate. Food lost its taste and sleep became a stranger. Each night he would sit near the window, staring into the backyard where everything had changed. The rain had stopped long ago, but he could still hear it in his memory. The thunder, the splash of water under his feet, the sound of his brother's voice that he could never forget. People around him tried to help, but he didn't want to see anyone. His neighbors came by, leaving meals and kind notes. But he couldn't face them. He couldn't face anyone. The guilt was too much. Even though everyone said it was an accident, he didn't believe it. How could something like that be an accident? He kept thinking that if he had waited just a few more seconds, if he had spoken instead of acting, everything would be different. At night, he replayed that moment over and over in his mind. The fear, the darkness, the rush of panic, it all felt so real then. But now, thinking back, he realized how wrong he had been. His brother hadn't been a threat. He had just been there trying to borrow something simple, something they'd shared countless times before. That thought broke him the most. His mother stayed quiet most of the time. She didn't yell or blame him, but her silence said more than words ever could. When she looked at him, her eyes carried pain and questions that had no answers. They lived under the same roof, but it felt like two strangers occupying the same space. She still cooked for him, still left tea by his side, but neither of them said much. There were no words left that could fix what had happened. One morning, Daniel walked into his brother's old room. It hadn't been touched since that night. The bed was still made, the book still open on the table, a half-finished cup of tea sitting on the shelf as if time had stopped. He sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up one of the notebooks lying there. Inside were small sketches, notes and plans his brother had made. Plans to fix the bike, plans for a trip they were supposed to take next month. Daniel's throat tightened as he ran his fingers over the pages. He remembered how his brother had always been full of ideas, always planning something new. He was the kind of person who believed that every problem had a solution. And now he was gone because Daniel hadn't stopped to think. The days turned into weeks. Daniel didn't go back to work. He couldn't stand the thought of pretending to be okay. His boss called a few times, asking when he might return, but Daniel couldn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know if he could ever return to normal life. Every corner of the house reminded him of what he'd lost. One afternoon, while cleaning up the living room, Daniel found an old photo album tucked away behind a drawer. Inside were pictures of their childhood, two boys smiling with missing teeth holding wooden toy cars, posing with their mother in front of a small garden. There was a photo of them building a treehouse, both covered in dust but grinning proudly. Another one of them fishing at the lake, arguing about who caught the bigger one. He smiled for the first time in weeks, but the smile faded quickly. Those moments felt like another lifetime. Back then, fear didn't control him. Back then, he didn't imagine worst-case scenarios or let panic lead his decisions. He wondered when that changed. Maybe adulthood did that, made him cautious, made him suspicious, made him see danger in everything. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep again. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing. He didn't know why, but it felt like something he needed to do. He began to write letters to his brother, the words spilling out one after another. "Dear brother," he wrote, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. I keep trying to find ways to make sense of what happened, but there aren't any. You didn't deserve this, and I can't forgive myself for letting fear guide me that night." He kept writing for hours. Every memory, every regret, every unspoken word. The letters became his only escape. He wrote about how lonely the house felt, how their mother barely talked, how the rain still made him flinch. By the time he stopped, the sun was rising and his notebook was filled with pages of pain and apologies that no one would ever read. A few days later, while sorting through a drawer, Daniel found his brother's phone. It was dusty, untouched since that night. He hesitated for a long time before turning it on. The screen lit up, showing missed calls and unread messages. As he scrolled, his breath caught. There was one message from that same night, sent just minutes before everything went wrong. "Hey, I'm outside, borrowing the wrench set. Don't get scared, okay?" Daniel froze. His heart dropped as he stared at the message. The battery had probably died before it reached him. He hadn't seen it. He never knew his brother had tried to warn him. That single message changed everything. The reality hit harder than ever. It wasn't just an accident. It was a tragedy built on silence, darkness, and bad timing. He placed the phone down slowly, his hands shaking. Tears filled his eyes, and he whispered softly, "I didn't see it, I swear I didn't." But there was no one to hear him. The message burned in his mind. Those few words could have changed everything. For the rest of the day, Daniel sat in silence. His mother found him later that evening holding the phone close to his chest. She sat beside him quietly, her eyes tired but gentle. After a long pause, she said softly, "He wouldn't want you to carry this forever." Her words were kind, but they didn't make the weight any lighter. Still, hearing her speak was something. For the first time in weeks, they shared a meal together. It was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet as before. There was something healing in the air, even if just a little. Over the next few days, Daniel started cleaning up the backyard. It wasn't easy. Every corner reminded him of that night, but he told himself it was time to face it. He fixed the broken shed door, trimmed the grass, and even repaired the light that had stopped working. Each task felt like a small step toward forgiving himself, though he knew true forgiveness would take time. As he worked, neighbors walked by offering kind words. Some told him they were praying for his peace, others just gave small nods. He appreciated their quiet support. It reminded him that the world hadn't stopped moving, even though his had. In the evenings, Daniel still wrote letters, but now the tone slowly changed. He began writing about memories, happy ones. He wrote about the time his brother taught him how to fix a bike chain, how they used to stay up late talking about dreams, and how his laughter always filled the room. These letters didn't make the pain disappear, but they helped him remember that his brother's life was more than just the way it ended. One morning, Daniel walked to the nearby park. The air was cool, and the sun was just rising. He sat on a bench and watched people pass by. Parents with children, joggers, old friends sharing coffee. For a long time, he hadn't really looked at the world around him. Everything seemed alive again. He realized that his brother wouldn't have wanted him to disappear into guilt. He would have wanted him to live, to move forward, to use this pain to do something meaningful. That thought stayed with him. That night, Daniel took all the letters he had written and placed them inside a wooden box. He tied it shut and placed it under a small tree in the backyard. Then he stood there for a long time, staring at the stars. The air was calm, The same backyard that once felt haunted now felt different, still heavy with memories, but somehow peaceful. He whispered softly, "I miss you, but I'll keep going." For the first time, he truly meant it. The guilt was still there, but now it carried purpose. It reminded him of how fragile fear could make a person, and how one moment of panic could change everything. But it also reminded him that healing, no matter how slow, was still possible. That night, Daniel finally slept, not dreamlessly, but peacefully. Months passed. Seasons changed, but Daniel's world still felt different. The pain was not as sharp as before, but it never completely left him. It had softened into something quieter, something that lived in the background of his days. He learned how to smile again, though it didn't come easily. Some mornings he still woke up expecting to hear his brother's voice calling him for breakfast or joking about something small, and every time that silence reminded him that life had moved on. Even if part of him was still standing in that rain-soaked night, he had stopped avoiding people now. The neighbors, who once kept a careful distance out of respect, began stopping by again. They talked about simple things, the weather, the plants in his garden, or the football games that played every weekend. Daniel would listen and nod, thankful that they still treated him like one of them. Slowly, the normal rhythm of life started returning, even if it came with quiet pauses in between. One morning, Daniel received a letter from the local community center. They were hosting a safety awareness workshop and wanted him to come share his experience. At first, he stared at the letter for a long time, unsure if he could ever talk about that night in front of others. It felt too personal, too heavy. But then he thought about the message on his brother's phone, the one he hadn't seen in time. Maybe, he thought, if he shared his story, it could stop someone else from making the same mistake. He didn't reply right away. For days, the letter sat on his kitchen table while he thought about it. Finally, one evening, he decided to go. He didn't plan to be a speaker or a storyteller. He just wanted to talk honestly, like one human to another. When the day came, he felt nervous. The room was small, filled with people from different walks of life. Parents, young workers, elderly folks, even a few students. Everyone was there to learn about what fear could make a person do. Daniel sat at the back, waiting quietly until one of the organizers called his name. He walked up slowly, his palms slightly sweaty. For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. The room was silent, waiting. Then he began. He didn't talk like a speaker giving a speech. He spoke like someone remembering, his voice soft but clear. He told them about that night, about the rain, the darkness, the panic. He told them about how fear had taken control of him before reason could catch up. He didn't dramatize anything. He didn't need to. His words came from a real place, and that made them powerful. As he spoke, some people in the room wiped their eyes quietly. Others nodded, understanding what fear could do. When he finished, there was a long pause, not the kind that comes from awkwardness, but from reflection. Then the audience clapped, not loudly but gently, a soft sound of respect. Afterward, a young man approached Daniel. He looked nervous but grateful. He said that hearing Daniel's story reminded him of a time he almost hurt someone out of panic during an argument. He said he never realized how easily fear could blur judgment. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Fear isn't the enemy. Acting before thinking is." That moment changed something inside Daniel. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from his pain. Over the next few months, Daniel began volunteering at the same community center. He helped organize meetings and spoke at small gatherings. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because every time he shared his story, it felt like he was slowly freeing himself, one word at a time. Each talk reminded him that he was human, that mistakes didn't have to define the rest of his life if he used them to guide others. He started meeting people who had also faced fear, people who had made decisions they regretted, people who had lost loved ones, and people who were still learning how to forgive themselves. They listened to him, and in their stories, Daniel found pieces of himself. At home, things began to heal too. His mother spoke more now. She had started tending the garden again, just like she used to when both sons helped her water the plants in the evenings. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, but sometimes they would sit together in quiet understanding. One afternoon, she handed him a small box. Inside was his brother's old watch. the one he used to wear everywhere. She smiled faintly and said, "He would have wanted you to have it." Daniel held the watch gently, running his fingers over the scratched surface. It wasn't fancy, but it carried years of memories. Camping trips, late-night bike rides, laughter, arguments, everything that made their bond real. He started wearing it every day, not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as a way of keeping his brother close to him. Sometimes, when he passed the shed in the backyard, he stopped and stood there for a moment. The fear that once filled that place was gone now. Instead, there was peace. The grass had grown back. The tools were neatly arranged, and sunlight often fell across the spot where everything had changed. It no longer felt like a place of tragedy. It felt like a place of learning, of acceptance. On one of those quiet afternoons, Daniel decided to write again. Not letters this time, but a small journal. He wrote about everything he had learned. Not about guilt, but about patience, communication, and courage. He wrote that fear wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to understand. He believed that fear had a purpose. It kept people cautious, but when it wasn't managed, it could take over. In his journal, he wrote, "The hardest part of living isn't surviving what happens to you. It's learning how to live with it afterward. But healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without breaking." Months turned into a year. The pain didn't vanish, but it became something different, a quiet strength that shaped him. People in his neighborhood began referring to him when someone needed advice or comfort. They saw him not as the man who made a mistake, but as the man who turned pain into wisdom. One evening, close to the anniversary of that night, Daniel walked to the cemetery. The air was cool and still, and the sky had that soft golden light before sunset. He carried a small wrench set in his hands, the same one his brother had come to borrow. When he reached the grave, he knelt down and placed it gently beside the headstone. He didn't cry this time. Instead, he smiled softly. "I finally fixed the shed," he whispered. "You'd laugh if you saw how long it took me." He paused, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm sorry it took me this long to understand. But I know now that fear doesn't have to control us. You taught me that even if you didn't mean to." He stayed there for a while, talking quietly as if his brother were still listening. The wind rustled the leaves above him, and for a brief moment it felt like a response. Gentle, peaceful. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and looked toward the horizon. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and red, the same colors that used to remind them of their childhood evenings spent playing outside. As he walked back home, the air felt lighter. The ache was still there, but it no longer pulled him down. It was just a part of him, like a scar that reminded him of where he'd been, but not where he was going. That night, Daniel sat by the window again, just like he used to. But this time he didn't stare into darkness. He looked at the stars, remembering his brother's laughter, the lessons learned, and the promise he had made to himself, to live with purpose, not fear. Before going to bed, he glanced at the journal on his table. On the last page, he had written a line he wanted to remember forever. "Fear once took something precious from me, but understanding gave me something back, the courage to live again." He closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay down. The night was quiet but not empty. Somewhere deep inside, he knew his brother would have been proud. And for the first time since that stormy night, Daniel truly slept in peace, not because he had forgotten, but because he had finally learned to forgive himself.